What does it mean when God says, I want you to loose the chains of injustice and set the oppressed free? Well, it looks like he goes on and describes it in verse 7. Because in verse 7 it says, is it not to share your food with the hungry, provide the poor wanderer with shelter, that's the homeless person, and clothe the naked? So it looks like in verse 6 when he says, I want you to do justice, in verse 7 he's saying, and what that means is, I want you to pour yourself out for the poor, for the hungry, for the naked, and for the homeless. In fact, down in verse 10, it says you are to spend yourselves. Spend yourselves. That's not just giving them a little bit of money. To spend yourselves means your whole life has to be involved. Now, a lot of people don't like putting 6 and 7 together. Because if you say, verse 6, do justice, is described in verse 7, care for the poor, some people don't like that because a lot of people say, well, verse 7 is talking about charity. We should be charitable to the poor. Now, the reason they would rather use the word charity is because charity is never obligatory. See, charity is optional, right? You may want to be charitable, maybe not. And if you're not helping the poor, then you're not being charitable. Well, that's a shame. You ought to be more charitable. But justice is not an option. And if verse 6 is describing verse 7, if Isaiah is actually saying, if God here is saying, if you don't feed the hungry, you're being unjust. Well, a lot of people say that's bad because they say, I don't believe that. I don't believe I owe the poor anything. If I want to give it to them, fine. But I don't owe them anything. It's not unjust. Maybe uncharitable, but not unjust. But that doesn't work. That argument doesn't work. Because look at the very last clause of verse 7. It says, share your food with the hungry, provide the poor wanderer with shelter, see the naked and clothe him, and don't turn away from your own flesh and blood. What does that mean? Now, own flesh and blood is usually what? When you hear that, what does that mean? Your family, someone you're related to. But the word poor wanderer, which is described here as your own flesh and blood, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and shelter the poor wanderer. Do not turn away from your own flesh and blood. What God is saying is that poor wanderer is your own flesh and blood, but the word poor wanderer means an impoverished person of another race. It's a word that's often translated stranger, alien, an impoverished person of another race. Yet God here is saying, when you turn away from a poor person in your city of another race, it's like turning away from your own flesh and blood. Why would he say that? In fact, it was outrageous to speak into a patriarchal society, like ancient societies were, where family meant everything and blood meant everything, and to say that the poor person of another race is your own flesh and blood. What is God saying? He's saying every human being is in the image of God. If you understand the fact that I created all beings, and they are all human beings, and they're all in the image of God, that therefore, if you turn away from them, it's as if you're turning away from your own flesh and blood. In fact, you are turning away from your own flesh and blood, and therefore, you are responsible for their needs, and to turn away from your own flesh and blood is wrong. It's not just uncharitable, it's wrong. This is a very strong argument, and it's tied to what we've talked about for several weeks. I don't know whether you've been here over the last few weeks or not, but what we've said is this. Yes, if you have this much, if this much is yours, to some degree it's because you worked hard for it, but only to some degree, and not to the main degree. Because the main reason why you have what you have is not just that you worked hard, is because you were born in this century rather than the 6th century. And you were born in the country you were born in, the century you were born in, the fact that you are born with, talent, your health, all of these things. Without them, you would be nowhere. And therefore, mainly what you have is a gift of God. And if you act as if it's yours, and if you want to give it away, that's completely up to you. No. If you act as if it's yours, that shows you do not understand your real relationship to God and the rest of the human race. What you have is a gift from God.